Three riders burst out from the sandy ridge, their horses kicking up a storm of red dust. They pulled their reins hard, circling the road like wolves closing in on prey. With a violent tug, one of them dragged a woman off a rickety wagon. She hit the ground with a thud, dust clinging to her skin, her dark hair spilling across her face. Laughter cracked the silence of the valley, sharper than the wind cutting across the plain. "Get up. You're nothing but a prize we earned." Thomas Whitmore spat the words, his eyes glinting with ownership. Beside him, his two sons, Eli and Warren, grinned wide, their boots thumping against their stirrups as if to mock a cornered animal. The woman did not answer. She curled inward, her black eyes burning with a silent defiance. Her name was Ahioka, an Apache woman torn from her people. To the Whitmores, she was no more than a piece of property to barter away. From the distance came the steady thud of another horse. Not hurried, not reckless calm, deliberate, inevitable. A lone rider crested the rise, broad-shouldered in the saddle, his right hand resting loosely near the worn grip of a revolver. Samuel Carter, owner of a modest ranch in Prescott Valley, was not a man who often interfered in other people's disputes. But this was no dispute. This was cruelty laid bare. Sam reined in just short of the commotion. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind whipped through, hot and dry, carrying the taste of iron and dust. He swung down from his horse, pulled a thick wool blanket from the back of the saddle, and walked forward. Each step echoed, with a kind of unhurried certainty, the kind that unsettled men who thought themselves untouchable. "Carter," Thomas sneered, spitting into the dirt. "This ain't your business. She belongs to us. Walk away while you still can." Sam didn't answer. Instead, he draped the blanket gently over Ahioka's shoulders. His eyes didn't linger on her exposed skin. He looked past her, toward the horizon, as though the act of covering her was as ordinary as riding a toppled fence post. Eli let out a bark of laughter. "What's this? Playing the hero? You'll regret crossing us." Finally, Sam's gaze lifted. His voice was low, steady as granite. "She's not yours. She's not anyone's." For a beat, the world stilled. Warren's hand twitched toward the pistol at his belt. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the Bradshaw Mountains, the promise of a storm to come. But Sam didn't waver. He took Ahioka's arm, helped her to her feet, and guided her toward his horse. The Whitmores shifted uneasily. They had expected fear, maybe bargaining. What they faced instead was a wall of silence and conviction. Sam lifted Ahioka onto the saddle, swung up behind her, and with a firm tug of the reins, turned his horse away. Dust billowed up in their wake, drowning out the curses the Whitmores hurled after them. He didn't look back. The ride home was quiet but heavy, the silence pressing as firmly as the blanket around Ahioka's shoulders. She sat rigid, staring at the horizon where the sun bled red into the earth. Sam's presence behind her was solid, steady, and strangely unthreatening. He did not speak, did not ask her name, did not demand thanks. His silence was its own kind of refuge. As the outline of the ranch finally came into view against the fading light, Ahioka's voice broke the long quiet, low, bitter, barely more than a whisper. "All white men are the same, aren't they?" The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, carried on the last breath of sunlight before it disappeared behind the mountains. Sam said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead, where the land stretched vast and unforgiving, and the first shadows of night began to claim the valley. The Carter Ranch sat quiet beneath the weight of evening, its outlines simple against the bruised horizon: one weathered cabin, a lean-to barn, and a rail fence stretching into the sage. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds gone stale. Samuel Carter pushed the door open and guided Ahioka across the threshold. She paused, wary, as though stepping into a trap. Her bare feet sank into the smooth planks of the floor, polished by years of use but swept clean. Sam didn't speak. He nodded toward a small room off the main space and laid another folded blanket on a narrow bed. "That's yours," he said at last, voice rough from disuse. On the quilt he placed a simple dress and a worn shift, both belonging once to his late mother. Then he turned away, striking a match to coax a flame into the hearth. Sparks flared, filling the silence with the faint crackle of fire. Ahioka stood rigid, her arms wrapped around herself beneath the coarse wool blanket. She eyed the clothes on the bed with suspicion. To her, they were not a kindness, but a reminder how easily one life could be stripped away and replaced with another. For long minutes she didn't move, her breathing shallow, the tension in her shoulders sharp as a bowstring. Sam didn't press. He set a pot on the stove, ladling in beans and bacon, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude. When he finally set 2 tin plates on the table, Ahioka emerged from the room. The wool blanket trailed from her shoulders, but now she wore the cotton dress. It hung loosely, but the fabric, though old, was clean and carried the faint scent of sun and soap. She avoided Sam's eyes, yet something in her step had shifted reluctant acceptance, or perhaps the smallest concession to dignity. They ate without words. The scrape of forks against tin echoed in the stillness, blending with the low sigh of the fire. Sam focused on his plate, chewing with the same calm deliberation he applied to everything. Ahioka glanced at him once, twice. Her expression guarded. He neither questioned her nor tried to break the silence. It was as if he knew speech, too soon, would only drive her further away. After the meal, Sam pushed back his chair, crossed to a small wooden box on the shelf, and set it on the table. Inside lay a few keepsakes. A faded photograph of a stern woman, his mother, Martha Carter, a handful of whittled birds, and a porcelain teacup, cracked and missing its handle. Sam closed the box again without a word, returning it to its place. To him, it was a fragment of memory. To Ahioka, it was a glimpse into the man who had taken her in. The evening deepened. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying the lonely call of a coyote. Ahioka wandered to the window, drawn by a flicker on the distant ridge. There, silhouetted against the fading light, stood a lone rider. The figure didn't move, only watched, a dark sentinel against the skyline. Her breath caught. She recognized the posture, the arrogance. Even from afar it was one of the Whitmore men. Her hand tightened around the blanket at her chest. For a long moment, she stood frozen, heart hammering. Then she turned back to Sam. He was cleaning the last plate, shoulders steady, as though he hadn't noticed. Did he see the rider? Did he already know? Ahioka couldn't tell. What she did know was that danger hadn't been left behind on the road. It had followed them here, to this small wooden house pressed against the wilderness. When she lay down that night, the quilt drawn up to her chin, her mind replayed the image of the rider on the ridge. Her distrust of Sam lingered, heavy as ever, but now it mingled with something sharper, fear. She wondered if his silence was strength, or if it was the kind of stillness that comes before violence. Morning came pale and brittle, the kind of light that felt thinner than it should, stretched across the Prescott Valley like a veil. Samuel Carter was already on his feet when Ahioka stirred. She heard the soft creak of floorboards, the muted thud of boots, the sound of metal being set down on wood. When she stepped into the main room, she froze. Sam sat at the table, sleeves rolled up, a lantern hissing low beside him. Before him lay a rifle broken down into its pieces. His hands moved with calm precision, wiping, oiling, reassembling each motion, practiced, deliberate. The metallic scrape and click carried a weight all its own. Ahioka stiffened, her heart quickening. The sight of a white man with a weapon was no new terror. She had known its consequence all her life. But there was something different in the way Sam worked. There was no swagger, no cruelty, only method, like a farmer sharpening a plow. He didn't look up. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, voice gravelly. It was the first casual words he had offered her. Ahioka hesitated, then poured a tin cup. The bitter steam rose against her face as she stood watching him. Each part of the rifle was tended with almost reverence, as though the gun wasn't a tool of dominance but a necessity in a world that never forgave carelessness. She noticed how steady his breathing remained, how he didn't glance at her or seek her reaction. It was as if her presence didn't require explanation. Minutes passed before she found her voice. "You prepare," she said softly, her accent curling around the words. Sam paused, the bolt of the rifle resting in his hand. He met her eyes at last. "Always." The answer unsettled her, not because it was threatening, but because it rang with a truth she recognized. Among her people, survival too had been a constant preparation. Fires banked for travel, weapons kept sharp, songs remembered so the world would not forget them. For the first time, Ahyoka saw not only the differences between them, but a reflection. The silence stretched, broken only by the quiet hiss of the lantern. She set the cup down and, without quite knowing why, stepped closer. When he reached for a cloth, she picked it up first and held it out. Sam accepted it without comment, their hands brushing for a fleeting second. The contact startled her more than it should have. He returned to his work, and she stood nearby, the lantern light throwing their shadows together on the wall. When the rifle was whole again, Sam set it gently across the table, his fingers lingering on the stock. He did not put it away. Instead, he looked at her with that same unyielding calm. "They'll come," Ahyoka whispered. It wasn't a question. Sam's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping once. "Yes." Uh. Her throat worked, the memory of the rider on the ridge burning behind her eyes. She waited for him to promise safety, to swear he'd keep the Whitmores away. But he didn't. What he offered instead was something quieter, heavier. "You won't go back." For the first time since she had been dragged from her people, Ahyoka felt her chest loosen, just a fraction. The fear remained, the distrust lingered, but beneath them both flickered something she had thought long dead. The possibility of belief. She turned away, retreating to her small room, yet his words followed her like the steady beat of hooves across dry earth. And though she didn't admit it, when she lay down, she slept more deeply than she had in many nights. The night broke with the sound of wind pressing hard against the cabin walls, a low moan weaving through the rafters like a restless spirit. Ahioka sat up, heart hammering. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the ground beneath her bed. Moments later, she heard the hurried thud of boots, the strike of flint against steel, and the flare of a lantern. Sam was already at the door, coat pulled over his shoulders, rifle leaning against the wall. "Stay inside," he said, voice tight. But before she could answer, the sharp, panicked bleating of a ewe cut through the storm. Something was wrong in the barn. Without hesitation, Sam snatched the lantern and stepped into the torrent of wind. Ahyoka hesitated only a heartbeat before following. The night swallowed her instantly, rain stinging her face, hair whipping wild in the gale. She caught sight of Sam ahead, his frame bent against the storm as he forced the barn door open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet hay and fear. A ewe lay on her side in the straw, flanks heaving, eyes rolling white. A lamb was coming, but wrong. Its small body twisted, breech. Sam knelt, hands already working with calm urgency. He glanced at Ahyoka, his face lit in sharp planes by the lantern. "Hold this," he said, nodding at the light. His voice was firm, commanding, but not unkind. She gripped the lantern, knelt in the straw beside him, and steadied her shaking hands. The glass grew warm beneath her fingers, the flame trembling with each gust of wind that leaked through the walls. Sam's hands were sure, coaxing, turning, guiding. Ahyoka held the light steady, her knees pressed into the damp earth, rain dripping from her hair. The ewe cried out, a sound of pain and desperation. For a long, suspended moment, it seemed the struggle would end in silence. Then, with a final pull, the lamb slid free, limp and slick. Ahyoka's breath caught in her throat. Sam worked quickly, clearing its airway, rubbing its small body with a scrap of burlap. Nothing. Then a shudder, a gasp, a weak, wavering cry that cut through the storm like a spark of life itself. Relief washed through Ahyoka so suddenly it almost hurt. She felt her eyes sting, her grip on the lantern tightening. Together, they had pulled life from the edge of death. Sam placed the lamb beside its mother, who nuzzled it with trembling urgency. For a moment, the storm seemed to recede. Sam sat back on his heels, breath heavy, eyes lifting to Ahyoka. She still held the lantern, the flame casting her face in gold, her hair plastered to her cheeks. Their gazes met his unreadable, hers raw with something she hadn't expected, gratitude. Later, back in the cabin, rain hammering the roof, Ahyoka broke the silence first. Her voice was small, almost swallowed by the storm. "Thank you." Sam looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. It wasn't dismissal, nor mere acknowledgement. It carried the weight of a conversation left unspoken, an understanding forged in the dark of the barn. That night, when she lay down, the sound of the storm no longer felt like a threat. It was only weather, passing. And for the first time, Ahyoka realized she had spoken to him not in suspicion, but in choice. The days after the storm stretched into a rhythm both fragile and steady. Morning light spilled over the Bradshaw Mountains, painting the valley gold. Sam rose before dawn, as always, his boots thumping softly across the floorboards before he slipped outside to tend to the cattle. Ahyoka listened to his movements, the steady cadence of a man who belonged to the land as much as the fences he built. Left alone, she wandered the small cabin. At first, she kept to the walls, silent as a shadow. But as the hours wore on, she began to touch the edges of his life. Her hand brushed along the rough wood of a chair, the smooth handle of a kettle. In her room, she discovered a small wooden box tucked away beneath the bed. Inside were carved birds, each feather etched with care, and the faded photograph of a stern-faced woman whose eyes mirrored Sam's. Ahyoka held the fragile porcelain teacup, cracked and broken, and found herself staring at its imperfection. Broken, yet still whole. One afternoon, driven by a need for air, she stepped onto the porch. The sky stretched endless above, the wind sharp and clean. In the distance, Sam was repairing a section of fence line, hammer rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the beat of her own heart. She watched him, the way his movements slowed for just a fraction when he realized she was there. He didn't wave, didn't call out. He simply kept working, granting her the dignity of being seen without being put on display. That evening, she found a rusty trowel in the barn and began pulling weeds from the small, neglected garden behind the house. The soil was dark, rich, grounding beneath her fingers. She worked slowly, methodically, until she uncovered a patch of wild mint clinging stubbornly by the fence. She tended to it with care, as if it were the first living thing she could claim as her own. When Sam returned from the pastures, sweat darkening his shirt, he found a glass of cool mint water waiting on the porch rail. He stopped, looked at the glass, then at her where she sat on the steps. Without a word, he drank it all, gave a single nod, and set the glass down. It was not thanks spoken aloud, but thanks understood. The fragile peace of those days was shadowed, though, by what lingered on the horizon. Ahyoka often caught herself glancing eastward, to the ridge where the Whitmores had once appeared. Each time she half expected to see them, mounted and waiting, patient as buzzards circling above the desert. And one evening, she did. A lone figure sat astride a horse on the distant rise, too far to make out his face, but close enough to know. The Whitmores were watching, her chest tightened, breath catching sharp. She felt again the helplessness of being dragged from her wagon, stripped of dignity, left bare before the world. She retreated inside, the cabin's walls suddenly fragile, too thin to keep out the threat pressing down from the hills. When Sam entered later, boots heavy with dust, she did not speak of what she'd seen, but she watched as he spread an oilcloth on the table, laid out his rifle, and began to clean it piece by piece. He said nothing of riders or danger, yet each click of metal, each stroke of cloth, was a conversation in itself. He knew. He was preparing. Ahyoka sat by the hearth, her hands clenched tight in her lap, and realized that his silence was not indifference. It was a promise. He would not let the world take from her again without a fight. The sky carried the weight of a coming storm, heavy with bruised clouds. All day the cattle had been restless, lowing uneasily, shifting at the fence line. Sam worked with steady hands, reinforcing the barn door, tying off ropes against the rising wind. His body moved with its usual economy, but his eyes kept drifting eastward, to the ridge. He was waiting. Ahyoka stood on the porch, her fingers gripping the rail until her knuckles turned white. She had seen it before Sam did. 3 riders cresting the rise, no longer distant shadows, but clear figures moving with grim purpose. Thomas Whitmore at the lead, his 2 sons flanking him like wolves scenting blood. Sam straightened slowly, wiping his palms on his trousers. His face hardened into stone. He walked toward the porch with unhurried strides, every step measured. They're here, Ahioka whispered, voice tight. Go inside, Sam said. His tone was quiet, absolute. She hesitated, her breath caught in her throat, fear thick in her chest. His eyes met hers, and he repeated, softer but edged with command. Inside, she obeyed, though she left the door cracked open just enough to see. The Whitmores rode into the yard, their horses throwing up dust that swirled in the growing wind. Thomas sneered, thin-lipped and cruel. Evening, Carter. We've come for what's ours. Sam stood on the top step of the porch, broad and unmoving. She's not yours. Eli swung down from his saddle, rope in hand, grin smug and certain. By law and by right, she is. You mean to stand against that? Sam's reply was as steady as the land itself. She stays. For a moment, silence. Then Eli stepped forward, rope swinging. His boots hit the first step, and Sam moved. It was not the reckless rush of a man picking a fight. It was the sudden, decisive force of a boulder breaking loose from a cliffside. He stepped down into Eli with his full weight, a block of solid muscle and will. The younger Whitmore sprawled into the dirt, breath knocked from his lungs. Thomas and Warren reached for their belts, but froze when Sam's eyes lifted to theirs. There was no shouting, no bluster, only a blaze of cold fire, a promise written into the set of his jaw. Leave, Sam said. His voice carried over the rising wind, final as a closing door. And don't come back. The storm broke then, thunder cracking overhead, rain slamming down in sheets. For an instant, the Whitmores hesitated, caught between rage and something deeper fear of a man who would not yield. They hauled Eli up from the dirt, retreating under the downpour, their curses swallowed by the roar of rain. Sam stood alone in the yard, water streaming from his hat and shoulders, his chest rising steady and unshaken. Behind the door, Ahioka pressed her hand to her lips, trembling not from fear alone, but from the raw power of what she had witnessed. The Whitmores had been turned away not by gunfire, not by blood, but by a will stronger than their malice. And as the storm raged on, washing the valley clean, a fragile peace settled inside the cabin. For the first time, Ahioka allowed herself to believe that perhaps, in this place, she was no longer prey. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come. By dawn the valley glistened, every blade of grass jeweled with water, the air fresh with the scent of sage and wet earth. The Whitmores were gone, their hoofprints already blurring into the mud. For the first time in weeks, the horizon felt empty of menace. Sam moved through the ranch with his usual calm, repairing storm damage, checking the fences, tending to the animals. But Ahioka noticed something new, in the way he carried himself less like a man bracing for an attack, more like one who had settled into his ground. His silence, still ever present, no longer felt like distance. It was steadiness, the kind a wounded spirit could lean against without fear of collapse. Ahioka too began to shift. She ventured outside more often, first to the porch, then to the neglected garden behind the house. Her hands found purpose in the soil, pulling weeds, turning earth, planting seeds she discovered hidden in a clay jar. The work grounded her, gave her something the Whitmores could not strip away: choice. One afternoon, she returned from the garden carrying sprigs of mint, their sharp fragrance clinging to her fingers. She set a glass of cool mint water on the porch rail and sat quietly on the steps. When Sam came back from the pasture, sweat darkening his shirt, he stopped at the sight. His gaze moved from the glass to her. Without a word, he lifted it, drank, and gave a single nod. It was all the thanks required. The days unfolded in this quiet exchange. Ahioka mended a tear in his work shirt with precise stitches. She swept the floors until the planks shone. These were not acts of servitude, but of partnership, threads weaving two solitary lives into something shared. Sam, in turn, softened in small, nearly imperceptible ways. A wildflower left on the table in the morning. A finger raised skyward to point out a hawk circling high above. He spoke little, but the gestures spoke enough. One evening, as firelight flickered across the cabin walls, Ahioka broke her silence. Her voice was steady, stripped of emotion, as though she were reciting facts rather than confessing wounds. She told him of her husband, of his weakness and kindness, of the fever that took him. She told him of the Whitmores, how they had claimed her as a debt unpaid, how they had taken not only land and livestock but her dignity, casting her out stripped bare before the eyes of the valley. Sam did not interrupt. He sat with his hands braced on his knees, his gaze fixed on the fire. The only sign of his reaction was the slow clench and release of his jaw. A muscle jumped once, hard, then stilled. When she finished, the room filled with a silence thicker than any words could be. It was not pity she found there, but acknowledgement the weight of her burden witnessed, shared, and finally set down between them. Ahioka exhaled, long and slow. For the first time in years, the telling had not cost her dignity. It had returned a measure of it. Outside, the wind stirred through the wet grass, carrying with it the clean scent of renewal. And inside the small cabin, where two solitary souls sat before the fire, something quieter than survival began to take root. The sky had been bruised purple all day, swollen with storm clouds that refused to break. The air felt heavy, charged, alive with the electricity of something waiting to happen. Even the cattle sensed it, their lowing restless, their movements sharp and uneasy. Sam stood at the edge of the barn, securing the last of the doors against the rising wind. His face was set, not in fear, but in readiness. He had been expecting this moment since the first time he saw the Whitmores on the ridge. From the porch, Ahioka watched the eastern horizon with eyes sharp and unblinking. And then she saw them, three riders cresting the ridge, this time not shadows, not watchers, but men with purpose. Thomas Whitmore rode at the front, his two sons flanking him like predators closing in. Her breath caught, her fingers digging into the railing. "They're here," she whispered. Sam didn't rush. He straightened slowly, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked toward the house. Each step was calm, deliberate, unhurried. When he reached the porch, he looked at her, his voice low but firm. Inside, she hesitated. Every part of her screamed to stay, to fight, to witness. But his eyes held hers, steady as stone, and she obeyed, retreating through the door though she left it cracked, heart pounding. The Whitmores thundered into the yard, horses churning up mud and dust. Thomas pulled his mount to a halt, his face twisted in contempt. "Even in Carter, we've come to settle what's ours. Send her out." Sam stood on the top step, broad-shouldered and still, as unmoving as the land beneath him. "She's not yours." Eli swung down from his saddle, a coil of rope in hand, his grin wide and vicious. "By law and by blood, she belongs to us. You gonna stand against that?" Sam's reply was steady, final. "She stays." Eli took a step forward, then another, boots sinking in the wet ground. His hand tightened on the rope. The storm above rumbled, a warning. Then Sam moved. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't wild. It was sudden, sharp, decisive. He stepped down from the porch into Eli with the full weight of his body, knocking the younger Whitmore sprawling into the mud. The rope flew from his hand, useless. Warren half drew the pistol at his belt, but froze as Sam lifted his eyes. There was no bluff in that gaze, no hesitation. Only the cold, unyielding fire of a man who had drawn his line in the earth and would not step back. "Leave," Sam said. His voice was low but carried, cutting clean through the rising wind. "And don't come back." For a long moment, the yard held its breath. Rain spat from the sky, the first drops of a storm breaking open. Thomas's mouth twisted, rage burning. But even he felt it, the certainty that no law, no rope, no false claim could break the will standing before him. With a sharp jerk of the reins, Thomas pulled his horse around. Warren followed, hauling Eli to his feet. They mounted, spat curses lost to the thunder, and retreated, swallowed by the storm. Sam stood in the yard, rain soaking him through, his chest rising steady. He didn't shout victory, didn't call after them. He simply turned back toward the cabin, the storm drumming against his shoulders. Behind the door, Ahioka pressed her palm to her lips, trembling. The fear still clung to her, but beneath it was something stronger. The undeniable knowledge that Sam had stood not just against the Whitmores, but for her. The storm broke fully then, rain cleansing the valley, washing the tracks of hooves into nothing. And within the small wooden cabin, Two lives, once separate, now carried the same weight of defiance against the world outside. The storm spent itself by dawn, leaving the valley rinsed clean. The air smelled of sage and wet soil, fresh and raw, as though the land itself had been remade. Mud clung to every step, and the fences bore the scars of wind and rain. But there was no longer the shadow of riders on the ridge. Sam moved through the morning with his usual precision, checking the barn, clearing debris, tightening rails loosened by the storm. His silence was steady, but not distant. It carried the weight of assurance, as if to say, the danger had come, and it had passed, and they remained. Ahioka rose with the light. For the first time since being forced into this valley, she did not feel like prey waiting in a trap. The storm had broken something loose inside her, the grip of fear that had wrapped around her chest since the Whitmores first appeared. She stepped outside barefoot, the mud cool between her toes, and tilted her face into the clean breeze. When she glanced toward the fence line, Sam was there, hammer in hand. He looked up, and for a moment their gazes locked across the wet earth. He didn't raise a hand or call to her, but something in his stillness felt like an invitation, a place not to hide, but to stand. She began to help in small ways, her movements tentative at first. She gathered loose boards, carried tools, steadied a post, while he drove in nails. Sam did not direct her, did not correct her. He simply worked beside her, their rhythm falling into step as naturally as rain into the soil. The cabin, too, began to change. Ahioka cleaned with purpose, sweeping the floorboards until they shone, mending worn curtains with quiet stitches. She dug deeper into the neglected garden, coaxing green from the dark earth, and each day the patch grew. A basket of beans, a cluster of herbs, mint thriving wild along the fence. Sam noticed, though he rarely said so. Sometimes a flower appeared on the table in the mornings, plucked from the hills. Sometimes he lingered a moment longer at the porch rail, watching her work. Words were sparse, but gestures bridged the silence. One evening, as firelight flickered across the walls, Ahioka placed something on the windowsill. The porcelain teacup, the broken one she had found in the box, had been carefully mended, its cracks still visible but holding fast. Inside, she had set a cluster of wildflowers, purple and vivid against the pale ceramic. Sam stopped when he saw it. He stepped closer, his hand brushing one of the petals with surprising gentleness. For a long moment, he simply looked at it, then at her where she stood across the room. And then, for the first time, his stern features softened into a slow, quiet smile. It wasn't wide, it wasn't showy, but it lit his face from within, transforming him. Ahioka's breath caught at the sight. In that moment, the cabin no longer felt like his house and her refuge. It felt like something else, something shared, something alive. The valley outside was scarred from storm and conflict, but inside, in the glow of the fire and the fragile bloom of flowers in a mended cup, a different kind of rebuilding had begun. Seasons turned quietly in the valley, each one laying its hand upon the land and upon the lives of the two who called it home. Autumn draped the hills in gold, leaves scattering across the yard like coins tossed by the wind. Winter followed, stark and white, pressing close against the cabin walls, the fire crackling through long nights. Then came spring, tender and green, pushing life from the dark earth once more. Through it all, Sam and Ahioka worked side by side. Their lives stitched themselves into a rhythm that needed few words. At dawn, Sam's boots thudded across the floorboards as he rose to tend the cattle. Ahioka soon followed, stepping into the garden or carrying water from the spring. Sometimes they crossed paths without speaking, each intent on their task, yet their silence was no longer distance. It was understanding, as if each knew the shape of the other's labor without needing to ask. Ahioka learned to mend fences, her hands roughened by rope and splintered wood. Sam showed her how to patch the roof, guiding her steps with a steadying hand when she balanced on the beams. She, in turn, taught him the herbs that grew wild along the foothills, leaves and roots that healed wounds or eased pain. There were moments of quiet laughter when he tasted something bitter, his grimace tugging at her lips until she too smiled. The cabin transformed with their touch. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, their scent mingling with smoke. Fresh hides stretched on racks near the barn. The once neglected garden now flourished, neat rows of beans and squash sprouting under Ahyoka's care. Even the broken teacup on the windowsill remained, its cracks visible but beautiful, now filled with blooms that changed with each season. In the small, unspoken gestures of their days, something larger grew. A loaf of bread left on the table, a flower placed by her seat, a hand that lingered just long enough when passing tools. Theirs was not a love declared in words, but one built in the steady accumulation of shared labor, mutual respect, and quiet trust. Winter tested them hardest. Snow pressed heavy on the roof, and nights stretched long and cold. Sam worked tirelessly to keep the animals sheltered and the woodpile full. Ahyoka kept the fire burning, her songs soft in her native tongue filling the silence as she sewed by the hearth. Sometimes, when the wind howled fiercest, Sam would sit across from her, listening, though he never said so. By the time spring returned, they had become more than two people sharing space. Their lives had intertwined like roots beneath the soil, unseen but unbreakable. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the valley, Ahyoka stood beside Sam on the porch. The air was filled with the calls of meadowlarks and the far-off rush of meltwater streams. Together they looked east, to the ridge where once danger had appeared. Now, it stood empty, crowned in green, the threat long gone. Ahyoka exhaled slowly, her hand brushing the railing, her shoulders easing for the first time in years. Sam glanced at her, then back to the horizon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The peace between them was enough. And as the valley breathed with the full